So as I'm getting set up in Photoshop here, I'll summarize what I'll cover. So the main things that I will touch on are compositing different photos together, layer blending modes, and using the tools and setting them to source the layer beneath so that you can work non-destructively. So the first, I can close this. The first thing I always do when I start in Photoshop is make sure to save as a PSD so that I can add layers and keep them. This is WLDM7636 texture. I'll duplicate my background layer. Just call this base. I can hide this. So I'll just delete out this white background. I use the magic wand tool and select it. And then just to make sure I don't end up with jagged edges. Actually, that looks pretty good. If you have jagged edges sometimes after making that selection, you can grow it or you can feather it by a couple pixels. And then delete. So our texture for this is going to be this part. So I can just delete the base. I'll leave it for now. So the main thing I do basically is I've opened up my different source images, and I'm just going to start compositing them together. This one shows a pretty good example at the top. I'm not really sure if it's any higher resolution. It looks like it's not, so I can delete that, and I can close this because I'm not really going to use it. So I'm basically going through and sort of analyzing my reference to figure out which ones I actually want to use. This one I think doesn't match, so I'll close it. There's a close-up of some of the mountains, but it's actually smaller than our original. So don't need that one. So I think what I need is the other ones from Wayfair. So this is unfortunate. The reason those images are not opening, I believe, is because Wayfair uses WebP compression. I'm not going to bother getting into it now. It's a different file format that gets displayed. So I'll just copy and paste instead. So these are all much lower resolution, but they show different parts of the pattern than we see in the main ones. I'll convert this to a smart object so I can scale it up and down, and so that if I need to scale it down, I don't lose resolution. Obviously, we're losing detail if I scale this up, but Photoshop does a pretty good job of making it look better.
Cái ảnh mình lấy bản có cái resolution nó nhỏ hơn cái đấy cũng rất là nhiều. Tuy nhiên là trong trường hợp này thì bạn cứ demo thôi, bạn scale lên để mà tránh bị vỡ quality hoặc là scale lại bất cứ lúc nào thì bạn đổi nó thành smart update.
So I'm basically lining up this other one that goes farther out here.
Nên là bây giờ mình có thêm cái phần bên trái.
It's like it needs to be a lot bigger. So Control T is the hotkey for scaling here that I'm using. And when we're doing transforms in Photoshop, when we hit Control T, we can move this center tick around to change where it will transform from. That may actually only work with rotation and not scaling. So we can see also this texture is sort of vertically compressed a little bit compared to our original. So I'll scale it this way also. This is approximate. We have some room for error because these are curved and painted anyway.
Như cái ảnh của cái đôi của cái bình này thì nó hơi bị kéo giãn được thành ngang so với ảnh gốc thì lại kéo nó hẹp lại để cho nó tỷ lệ chuẩn hơn. Về thực tế khi mà làm thì mình sẽ luôn luôn có một cái khoảng sai số nhất định và được cho phép nên là cứ thế mà làm thôi. Bởi vì thực tế cái này cũng chỉ là mình vẽ nên là nó sai cũng không có ảnh hưởng.
So the main thing I'm trying to get is this pattern as it wraps off the side. We can see in our original, we see a little bit of a tree and it kind of fades away. And in here, you see a lot more. So this is not perfect, but for the sake of time, I'll leave it alone. So what I'll do here is add a layer mask, and then I will just start painting in black in my layer mask to erase out what I don't want. I can make this brush really big for this part. These sides are too faded. Once we start getting in closer and we want to blend the patterns, that's where partial opacity helps. So here are the brush settings in Photoshop for pressure sensitivity. I usually have my spacing down, shape dynamics, control, pen pressure. So our angle jitter should be at 0%. The control should be set to either pen tilt or pen direction. They're similar enough. I think they both work. And transfer, we want the opacity jitter also, pen pressure, and flow jitter also, pen pressure. So this is not working right now because I plugged my tablet in while Photoshop was open and it can't detect the pen. If you push this button, it tries to force it, but it still is not detecting it. So I am going to close and reopen Photoshop. So it looks like Photoshop is still not detecting my pen, which is unfortunate. It tells you that with that little exclamation point. You can try and make it work, and if it doesn't, we will move on. All right, well, we'll just deal with it. These are the settings that are good, if it's actually working. So I want to talk about color adjustments and adjustment layers. I noticed some people creating adjustments to colors by using the image and then adjustment and something like hue saturation. I don't like that because it's in your layer and you can't toggle it on or off. So instead of using those, please use adjustment layers, which is under image and, layer, new adjustment layer. So I can do a hue or saturation layer and change these. By default, it'll affect all your layers, but if you right click, you have to make sure the adjustment is active here instead of the mask. So with the adjustment active, you right click and, oh, why is it not? Oh, all right, that was my mistake. You right click on the text over here and, oh, create clipping mask, yes. An alt click is the other way, yeah. So if you hold the alt key down and move the mouse in between there until we see that symbol, toggle that on and off. So now it only affects that one layer. So for adjustments in general, always do that. So this is just my example. Really, I'd want to do that on this one to match the color to the one behind it. You can also add an adjustment layer from down here, hue saturation, and alt click. So to me, it looks a little too dark and saturated. So just a little less saturated, a little bit lighter, kind of trying to match up these blues. We could adjust the hue a little bit if we need to. And then to actually get these to fade in our main mask here, I will use a soft brush and very low opacity, since the pressure isn't working. So we basically want to fade from the top layer to the outer layer in the area where these trees come up. And since I'm painting in this layer mask, I erased out too much and I can see the background. I can then paint in the opposite color, white, to put the mask back. And in Photoshop, if you hit the X key, it just switches back and forth between those two colors. So I can kind of paint that back in there. I also use the brackets to make the brush bigger and smaller. So we might need the islands here to be a little lower so that we can see, or I guess the left is really what we need. So this part we can erase out since that'll actually be the bottom of the skew. So that I want my opacity all the way up for. Kind of fade there. So I won't go through and do the whole thing. I just wanted to show you all the techniques that I use. A few other techniques to keep in mind as we're doing this. So we can kind of see these elements in the background start repeating the different islands. So really we need our texture to stretch all the way across the entire image. So when we are using the clone stamp tool, this is spot healing brush, clone stamp. So you can make a new layer. I'll call this cloned layer, and set the clone stamp tool to use current layer and below. So as I'm sure you guys know, when you hold Alt and click to source, and then you start painting here. So I'm painting on top of it, but if I hide all the other layers, which I can do by holding Alt and clicking on the eye, it only put down what was on that other layer. So this is a good way to work non-destructively so that I don't have this all on one layer. It's too bright there, obviously, so now I can just either erase that out. Or I can use a layer mask on here if I really want to instead. But basically using this technique, we can start creating full textures to wrap around without having to do a planar projection. We probably only need half of it. So what we can probably do is so basically we can have say this half and this half on top of each other, because we're not going to see them both at the same time. If we're looking at it this way, we can't see the other half. We're at an angle. These polygons here will match these that are off the screen. So I think this one actually needs to be more saturated. So the color match isn't perfect, but just to give an idea of how I proceed with this kind of thing. Basically, it looks like this house down here is a repetition of this house. So I can clone stamp that again on my cloned layer, start painting it in down here. Looks like I went too far up here and it doesn't match. So now instead of having to undo all that, oh, I did put that on the same layer. So let's do a clone layer 2, start painting that in here. And then I can kind of erase out if I go too far here. And with the soft brush and a low opacity, I can fade how I need to. So we're just about out of time. Do you have questions on these before we go? I obviously didn't have time to finish the whole thing, but does that give you good techniques you can use?
Nói chung là cái phương pháp mọi người đều nắm hết rồi đúng không? Vâng.
Yeah. Any questions? Good. All right. So I will work on this a little more in my own time, and I can show you guys a later stage of how I would apply this texture back to the model. So we'll see how far we can get with it, and I'll let you know if I have any additions or revisions to this. Thank you for listening.
Về bạn ấy làm và đây là bạn ấy dùng cái thôi, chủ yếu cái mình nắm lại được là mình nên làm sao mình không thể sửa lại được, bởi vì mình khác phải sửa mà có bao giờ qua được chưa cái vòng một vậy đâu. Nhưng mà bạn sẽ về bạn ấy làm cái texture này, nhưng mà bạn sẽ giữ nguyên cái layer này để sau mình sẽ theo dõi cách bạn ấy làm.
Thank you.
Thank you.